Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight I want to speak to you about something that will challenge everything you've been taught about what's possible and what's not. I want to share with you the secret of manifesting the seemingly impossible. Before we begin, let me ask you something. What is it that you desire but have dismissed as impossible? What dream have you buried because someone told you it was unrealistic? What healing have you given up on because the doctors said it couldn't be done? What financial breakthrough have you stopped believing in because the circumstances seem too dire? What relationship have you written off because it appears hopeless? I want you to hold that desire in your mind as we speak tonight, because I'm going to show you that there is no such thing as impossible. There are only assumptions you haven't dared to make. You see, my friends, the word impossible is nothing more than a limitation of the human imagination. It's a boundary that exists only in the minds of those who do not understand the true nature of consciousness. When you truly comprehend what consciousness is and how it operates, you realize that the only impossibility is impossibility itself. Let me tell you a story that happened just last month. A woman came to see me in tears. She said, "Neville, my son has been missing for 3 years. The police have given up. Everyone says he's dead. They tell me I need to accept reality and move on. But I can't. I won't. Is there anything I can do?" Now, by all conventional standards, this seemed impossible. 3 years missing, no leads, no hope according to everyone around her. But I looked at this desperate mother and I said, "My dear, the only reality you need to accept is that your son is alive, well, and coming home to you." "But how can you say that?" she asked. "You don't know what happened to him." I said, "I know something far more important. I know that consciousness creates reality, not the other way around. I know that what you assume to be true becomes true. And I know that if you can imagine your son walking through your door, healthy and happy, and if you can feel the reality of that reunion with every fiber of your being, then that imaginal act must and will manifest in your world." She looked at me as if I had lost my mind, but I continued. "Every night before you sleep, I want you to hear his key in the lock. I want you to feel him embrace you. I want you to smell his familiar scent. I want you to have the conversation you'll have when he returns. Live in that reality so completely that his absence becomes the dream and his presence becomes the truth." 6 weeks later, she called me, sobbing with joy. Her son had contacted the police. He'd been suffering from amnesia after an accident, living in another state under a different identity. His memory had suddenly returned, and he was coming home. Was this impossible? According to human reasoning, yes. According to the infinite power of consciousness, it was inevitable the moment she assumed it to be true. This is what I want you to understand tonight. There is nothing impossible to consciousness, because consciousness is the very substance from which all things are made. When the Bible says with God all things are possible, it's not speaking of some distant deity. It's speaking of the God consciousness that you are. But why do most people fail to manifest what they consider impossible? Because they approach it with the wrong consciousness. They try to manifest the impossible while remaining in the consciousness of impossibility. They affirm their desire while feeling their limitation. They visualize their dream while believing in their current circumstances. You cannot manifest the impossible from the state of consciousness that sees things as impossible. You must first become the person for whom this so-called impossibility is natural, normal, and inevitable. Let me share another story. A gentleman came to my lectures who had been told by doctors that he would never walk again. A devastating spinal injury had left him paralyzed from the waist down. He'd been in a wheelchair for 2 years, and every medical expert confirmed that his condition was permanent and irreversible. But after hearing these teachings, something stirred within him. He decided that he would no longer accept the verdict of the medical establishment. Every night he would imagine himself walking, not hoping to walk, not wishing to walk, but actually experiencing the sensation of walking. He told me later, "Neville, I didn't just see myself walking. I felt the ground beneath my feet. I felt my muscles moving. I felt the joy of motion through my entire body. I made it so real in my imagination that sometimes I would wake up surprised to find myself in the wheelchair." Month after month, he persisted in this imaginal act. His family thought he was in denial. His doctors were concerned about his mental state. But he knew something they didn't know. He knew that imagination creates reality. After 8 months of persistent imagining, something began to happen. He started to feel tingling in his legs, sensations that doctors said were impossible, then slight movement, then strength returning. Within 18 months he was walking again. The doctors called it a miracle. The medical journals called it unexplained. But he knew exactly what had happened. He had dared to assume what seemed impossible until it became inevitable. Now, I want you to understand something crucial about manifesting the impossible. It's not about overcoming obstacles. It's about transcending the consciousness that sees obstacles in the first place. The impossible doesn't become possible. Rather, you rise to a level of consciousness where impossibility doesn't exist. You see, what you call impossible is only impossible from your current state of consciousness. From a higher state, it's not only possible, it's already done. The person you become when you truly embody your desire doesn't struggle to make it happen, because in their consciousness it has already happened. This is why Jesus could say, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. Not believe that you will receive it, but believe that you have received it. Present tense, already done. This is the consciousness that makes the impossible inevitable. But how do you develop this consciousness? How do you move from seeing something as impossible to experiencing it as already accomplished? The secret lies in what I call the leap of faith, but not faith as most people understand it. Faith is not blind belief. Faith is not hoping for the best while expecting the worst. Faith is not wishful thinking or positive affirmations. True faith is the ability to feel the reality of your desire so completely that it becomes more real to you than your current circumstances. Let me tell you about a young man who came to my lectures with what seemed like an impossible dream. He was working as a janitor in a small office building, barely making ends meet, with no education beyond high school. But he had a burning desire to become a successful film director. Everyone around him said it was impossible. You don't have connections, they said. You don't have money for film school. You don't have experience. You're too old to start. Be realistic. But this young man understood something profound. He understood that impossibility is just a story we tell ourselves about limitation. So he decided to tell himself a different story. Every day as he cleaned those offices, he would imagine himself on movie sets, directing actors, making creative decisions, seeing his name in the credits. He would feel the satisfaction of completing a film, the excitement of premiere night, the joy of seeing audiences respond to his work. More importantly, he began to think from his desire instead of about his desire. Instead of thinking, I want to be a director, he began thinking, I am a director. Instead of cleaning those offices as a janitor who dreamed of making movies, he cleaned them as a director who was currently between projects. This shift in consciousness changed everything. He began to notice opportunities that had always been there but were invisible to his previous state of consciousness. He met people who could help him. Resources appeared that he hadn't seen before. Within 3 years, he had written, produced, and directed his first independent film, which won awards at several festivals. Was this impossible? From the consciousness of limitation, absolutely. From the consciousness of fulfilled desire, it was inevitable. The key to manifesting the impossible is to understand that there are no impossible things. It's only impossible states of consciousness. Change your state, and what seemed impossible becomes not only possible but unavoidable. But here's where most people stumble. They try to manifest the impossible while holding on to the very beliefs and assumptions that make it seem impossible in the first place. They want to heal while believing in the reality of their illness. They want wealth while feeling poor. They want love while feeling unworthy. You cannot serve two masters. You cannot simultaneously hold the consciousness of your limitation and the consciousness of your liberation. You must choose, and choosing means letting go of everything that contradicts your assumption of fulfillment. This is what I call dying to be reborn. The old consciousness, the one that sees your desire as impossible, must die for the new consciousness to be born. You must be willing to abandon your comfortable relationship with limitation in order to embrace the uncomfortable unfamiliarity of infinite possibility. I remember a woman who wanted to reconcile with her estranged daughter after 15 years of complete silence. Their relationship had ended in bitter conflict, harsh words had been spoken, and all attempts at reconciliation had failed. The daughter had moved across the country and refused all contact. By every reasonable standard, this reconciliation was impossible. Too much time had passed. Too much hurt had accumulated. The daughter had made it clear she never wanted to see her mother again. But this woman decided to live in the assumption that she and her daughter were reconciled, that they had a beautiful relationship, that they spoke regularly and lovingly. Every day she would imagine conversations with her daughter. She would feel the warmth of their renewed connection. She would experience the joy of their reconciliation so completely that sometimes she would reach for the phone to call her, forgetting that they weren't actually speaking. For months, nothing changed in the external world, but everything was changing in the world of consciousness. This mother was becoming someone for whom reconciliation with her daughter was natural and normal. Then one day, completely out of the blue, her daughter called. Through tears, she said, "Mom, I don't know why, but I've been thinking about you constantly. I miss you. Can we talk?" Was this impossible? According to the laws of human psychology and the evidence of years of estrangement, yes. According to the laws of consciousness, it was inevitable the moment the assumption was made and maintained. You see, what we call miracles are simply the natural result of consciousness operating according to its own laws. These laws are as reliable and predictable as the law of gravity. They just operate in a dimension that most people don't understand. When you truly grasp this, you realize that nothing is impossible because impossibility itself is impossible. Consciousness has no limitations except the ones it accepts. And since you are consciousness, you have no limitations except the ones you accept. But accepting a new assumption, especially one that contradicts all evidence, requires tremendous courage. It requires what I call the courage of the creator. You must be willing to stand alone in your assumption while the whole world tells you you're wrong. This is not easy. When you're manifesting the impossible, everyone around you becomes a prophet of limitation. They'll show you statistics that prove it can't be done. They'll tell you stories of others who tried and failed. They'll remind you of all the reasons why you should be realistic. But you must remember that their belief in impossibility is just as creative as your belief in possibility. They are creating a world where your desire is impossible. You are creating a world where it's inevitable. The question is, which world will you choose to inhabit? I knew a man who was $500,000 in debt, with creditors threatening legal action. His business had failed. His house was in foreclosure and his credit was destroyed. Everyone told him to declare bankruptcy and start over. By every financial measure, his situation was hopeless. But this man understood the power of assumption. Instead of assuming he was bankrupt, he assumed he was financially free. Instead of feeling the stress of debt, he cultivated the feeling of abundance. Instead of thinking about his problems, he thought from the solution. Every morning he would sit quietly and feel what it would be like to be completely debt-free with money in the bank. He would imagine the relief, the freedom, the peace of mind. He made this feeling so real that it became more compelling than his actual circumstances. Within 6 months, a series of seemingly miraculous events unfolded. An old business contact offered him a lucrative consulting contract. A distant relative left him a substantial inheritance he didn't know existed. A legal settlement from a case he'd forgotten about came through. Not only was he able to pay off all his debts, but he ended up with more money than he'd ever had before. Was this impossible? According to financial logic and statistical probability, absolutely. According to the infinite creativity of consciousness, it was simply consciousness expressing as form in response to a persistent assumption. This is what I want you to understand. Consciousness doesn't know about impossible. Consciousness only knows about assumptions and their inevitable manifestation. When you assume something is impossible, consciousness manifests that impossibility. When you assume something is inevitable, consciousness manifests that inevitability. The choice is always yours. You can assume limitation and experience limitation, or you can assume fulfillment and experience fulfillment. But you cannot assume one and experience the other. This is why I tell people, dare to assume what you dare not assume. Make assumptions so bold that they frighten you with their audacity. Assume states of consciousness so elevated that they make your current problems seem like the dreams of a fevered imagination. But assumption alone is not enough. You must persist in your assumption until it hardens into fact. This is where most people fail when attempting to manifest the impossible. They make the assumption for a day, a week, maybe even a month, but when they don't see immediate results, they abandon it and return to their old consciousness of limitation. The impossible takes longer to manifest not because it's more difficult for consciousness, but because it requires a more complete death of the old self and birth of the new. You must persist in your assumption until you become so identified with the new consciousness that the old consciousness becomes foreign to you. But let me be very clear about something. Manifesting the impossible is not about forcing outcomes or manipulating circumstances. It's about becoming so aligned with your desire that its manifestation becomes as natural as breathing. When you truly embody the consciousness of your fulfilled desire, you don't struggle to make it happen. You don't worry about how or when it will manifest. You simply know that it must and will, just as you know the sun will rise tomorrow. This knowing is not intellectual. It's felt. It's a deep cellular certainty that permeates every aspect of your being. It's the difference between hoping something will happen and knowing it already has happened in the realm of consciousness and is simply making its way into physical form. So how do you develop this knowing? How do you move from seeing your desire as impossible to experiencing it as inevitable? The answer lies in consistent, persistent, imaginative practice. Every night before sleep, when your conscious mind is quiet and your imagination is most receptive, I want you to enact the scene that would exist if your impossible desire were already fulfilled, not as a distant hope or future possibility, but as a present reality. If you desire healing, feel the vitality coursing through your body. If you desire wealth, feel the security and freedom that abundance brings. If you desire love, feel yourself beloved and cherished. Make it so real in your imagination that your physical senses are convinced it's actually happening. The secret is to make your imaginal act more vivid and compelling than your physical circumstances. When your imagination becomes more real than your five senses, reality has no choice but to conform to your imagination. But remember, this is not a technique you do once or twice and then wait for results. This is a way of being. You must live from your assumption, not just think about it. You must become the person for whom your desire is natural, normal, and already accomplished. And here's something crucial. When you're manifesting the impossible, you must be prepared for resistance, not just from others, but from your own habitual consciousness. Your old self will fight to maintain its familiar limitations. Your rational mind will present you with evidence of why your assumption is unrealistic. This is natural and expected. Don't fight these doubts. Simply redirect your attention back to your assumption. Every time you catch yourself thinking from your old consciousness of limitation, gently but firmly return to thinking from your new consciousness of fulfillment. Remember, you're not trying to convince your mind that something impossible is possible. You're training your consciousness to inhabit a reality where impossibility doesn't exist. There's a profound difference. The impossible is only impossible for someone who believes in impossibility. For consciousness that has transcended such limitations, all things are not only possible but inevitable when properly assumed and persistently maintained. So tonight I challenge you to examine your deepest desires, the ones you've labeled impossible, unrealistic, too good to be true. I challenge you to dare to assume their fulfillment. I challenge you to become so bold in your assumptions that you shock yourself with your own audacity. But most importantly, I challenge you to persist. Persist in your assumption, regardless of what others say. Persist despite contrary evidence. Persist until your assumption becomes more real to you than your circumstances. Persist until the impossible becomes inevitable. For you are not human beings having spiritual experiences. You are consciousness itself, temporarily forgetting its own infinite creative power. When you remember who you truly are, nothing remains impossible. Everything becomes a matter of assumption and persistence. The question is not whether you can manifest the impossible. You are already doing it. The question is, will you do it consciously or unconsciously? Will you create by design or by default? Will you assume limitation or liberation? You are the operant power in your world. You are consciousness expressing as individual experience. You are the God of your own reality. And for God, nothing is impossible, including the realization of your most impossible dreams. Dare to assume. Dare to persist. Dare to become the version of yourself for whom your impossible desire is already an accomplished fact. The impossible is waiting for you to make it inevitable. Thank you and good evening.